Good evening, and welcome to our audience here in the single kerk. Thank you for braving this wet, gray November night for coming out. And thank you to all of you who have joined us online for this special event. For now, it is my great privilege to introduce Philippe Sands, even if he needs no introduction. He is Queen's Counsel, a human rights lawyer, a professor of law at the University College of London, a practicing barrister at Matrix Chambers, and will be visiting professor at Harvard this spring. Philippe Sands has been involved in cases at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, including Pinochet, Congo, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Iraq. He has written 14 academic books and been awarded numerous prizes for his outstanding work. In 2019, here in Amsterdam, he was our distinguished Never Again Auschwitz laureate. He is not just a lawyer and historian. Philippe Sands is a quintessential investigator and storyteller, as any reader of his East-West Street, and more recently, the Ratline, will attest. He has a great talent for making personal stories public stories and examining grand historical events through microhistories. Philippe Sands will now speak to us, give some background on the Ratline for perhaps 20 minutes, following which I will talk with him about a number of important questions he raises in his writings. And following our conversation, we will have time for questions from the audience and also in the chat. So Philippe, the podium is yours, but tread it carefully.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly nice to be here. Thank you for the very generous introductions. My thanks to the German Embassy, to the Goethe Institute, to Spectrum, and to all of you who've come out after the last 18 months that we have all shared in a very communal way. It's incredibly nice to be in a room, a real room with real breathing human beings. It's rare, happy, wonderful thing. I thought what I would do on this occasion of being back in the Netherlands, it's a country that I know very well. I spent a lot of time, mostly in The Hague, but it's awfully nice to be back after 2 years away. Is say a little bit about how this project came about. Put a bit of context. Essentially, East-West Street and the Ratline, and the third in the series, which will come out in 2024, and which will be about Pinochet in London, deals with issues of identity. Who are we? And in particular, the catalyst was questions that I had about my own identity. I was very close to my grandfather, who was born in Lemberg in 1904, lived there until 1914, moved to Vienna and remained there until January 1939, when, as a Jew, he was expelled and made his way to France. For me, he was a Frenchman. By the time I was born in 1960, he was a Parisian who lived on the Rue de Maubeuge, next to the Gare du Nord, and we never talked about what happened before. We never talked about what happened before 1945. I think the reason for that was I and my brother had been told not to ask any questions. And on that side of the story, this was a pretty common feature of family life. Not perhaps because it was embarrassing, but because it was painful and difficult, and these things were best not addressed. What I didn't appreciate, of course, growing up, was what it was like on the other side of the story. And I only really came to begin to understand what it means to be a descendant, not of the victim side, if you want to put it in those terms, but of the perpetrator side, when in 2010 I received an invitation to give a lecture in the city of Lviv in Ukraine. I didn't know Lviv was Lemberg or Lvov or Leopolis. I thought they were all different places, but they're all the same place at different times of their existence. Part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of Poland, part of the independent, short-lived Western Ukrainian Republic. And the lecture invitation, which was to talk about the cases I have done, mostly, I would say, in the Netherlands, but not, thankfully, involving behaviour of the Dutch, on crimes against humanity and genocide. And I embarked in accepting the invitation on a journey that I could not possibly have imagined the doors that would be opened. I accepted the invitation not because I particularly had a burning desire to give a lecture about crimes against humanity and genocide and the work that I do, the cases that I have done, but because I wanted to find the house where my grandfather was born. And I wanted to find the house where my grandfather was born because I wanted to know who he was. And I wanted to know who he was because if I knew better who he was, I'd know better who I was or who I am. And so these issues of identity and memory and the sharing of information were absolutely central to the embarkation moment of this project. East-West Street tells one story. It's very largely, but not exclusively, about my own family. Many of you here will have read it, but also about the lives of two remarkable men, Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, who effectively invented the concepts of crimes against humanity, the protection of individuals, and genocide, protection of groups, and also of the life of the man who, if you like, offered the glue that bound together the lives of my grandfather Leon Buchholz, Hirsch Lauterpacht, and Raphael Lemkin by exterminating the totality of their families. That man's name was Hans Frank. I had no idea when I embarked on that first visit that I would write a book, nor as I began to write a book that it would end up being translated into Dutch or German or other languages. I'm used to writing academic books that sell about 18 copies, which I'm completely through. But something different happened. It seems that this story unleashed a series of consequences. And I can't really take credit for it in the sense that I didn't plan it, I didn't foresee it, I didn't intend it. It sort of just happened. I sort of stumbled into it. In the course of writing East-West Street, I adopted essentially the same techniques that I would do in preparing a case at the International Court of Justice, working, for example, with my late dear friend, Judge James Crawford. We would research everything. We would leave no stone unturned in trying to work out what had happened. What were the facts? How could you explore this from a different angle? Because International Court of Justice cases run for years and years and years, you've got time to do that. And I learned from James and from others that it was necessary to do that, in particular when you were arguing before a panel of 15 judges, all of different nationality, all with their own cultural, political, historical, ideological baggage. And one of the things that I did in reaching out in the research exercise was to ask a research assistant of mine, a German research assistant, to find everything that had ever been written about Hans Frank. And it's a lot. The Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933. And in the vast pile of materials that emerged, most of which was in German, was a book published in Germany in 1989 called Der Vater, The Father, which was Nicholas Frank's memoir and account of his relationship with his father, Hans Frank. And it was a remarkable book in many respects. And I reached out to Nicholas and eventually tracked him down, and he accepted to meet with me in Hamburg. I was doing a case at the Internationales Seegerichtshof, the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, in Hamburg, and he lives near Hamburg. I will never forget the first time I met Nicholas Frank. The first thing he said to me was, Philippe, you must understand I engage the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. And the second thing he did was to take out of his breast pocket a photograph of his father's dead body, freshly hanged at Nuremberg exactly 75 years ago. Now, for a guy from London, both things were surprising. And one thing led to another. We'd become very close friends. It's pretty remarkable. The grandson of a man whose entire family was murdered by Hans Frank should become such close friends with the son of Hans Frank, but that is exactly what has happened. And I think he feels exactly the same way. And that's a hopeful thing, and an optimistic thing, and a good thing. It says that over 70 years, a lot can change. One day, Nick said to me, Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg, it's where your grandfather was from. I'm sure you know about the gouverneur of Lemberg, Otto Wächter, or Otto von Wächter, depending on your politics. Would you like to meet his son, Horst? And I said, yes, I would. I don't know why you'd want to meet me, but I'd be very happy to meet him. And one thing led to another, and a few months later, in the spring, actually winter, January, February 2012, Nicholas and I met in the village square of Hagenberg, northern Austria, and went to spend a day with Horst Wächter. And I liked him straight away. I liked his Birkenstocks, I liked his pink t-shirt, I liked his warmth and his generosity, totally impecunious, living in abject poverty in his 15th century schloss. And I was so interested in him that I offered to an editor at the Financial Times to write a profile, which was then published in May 2013, called My Father, a Good Nazi. Because the thing about Horst is he believed it was his filial duty to find the good in his father, to honour his father, and to love his father. And I understood that, actually. I mean, I don't have any difficulty at all with that instinct. The problem was, of course, that Otto Wächter, supported entirely by his spouse, Charlotte Wächter, was a mass murderer who had been indicted in 1945 for mass murder, the murder, genocide, crimes against humanity of hundreds of thousands of human beings, Poles and Jews and others. But Horst didn't quite see it that way. I remember the first conversation I ever had with him. His view was, yes, these things happened. Very important. Horst is not a Holocaust denier, and Horst is not an anti-Semite. But, he said, although my father was involved in these things, he did not want to be involved in these things. And that means that I can treat him as a decent man. And there was something else that Horst is very attached to. He said, Philippe, you're a lawyer. You understand that until you've been convicted by a court of law, you are innocent. And my father was never convicted by a court of law. He disappeared after the war ended in Europe in May 1945 and did not reappear until the summer of 1949, dead in a Vatican hospital in Rome. And so, Horst says, you have to accept, on his death, he was an innocent man. He was not guilty of any crimes at all, which, of course, is, in technical formal terms, absolutely true. So the article was published. Horst hated it, broke off relations with me, but then came back a couple of months later and participated in the making of a BBC documentary called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. Horst hated that too. He said it had the wrong title. The title should have been My Nazi Legacy, what our fathers did and did not do, broke off relations, but then came back, because in the film there was a scene where Nicholas Frame says of Horst Wechsler, I think he is a kind of new Nazi. Now, I disagreed with that. What had caused Nicholas to say that was we had visited Ukraine in the summer of 2014 and attended the annual ceremony of the Waffen-SS Galicia division, a division created by Otto Wechsler, and at which there were hundreds of Ukrainians present, wandering around in Waffen-SS uniforms. Now, Nicholas and I and the filmmaker David Evans were rather perturbed by this, but Horst thought it was terrific, because here were all these lovely people who adored his father, who had done this fantastic thing. Nicholas reacted rather negatively to that, describing Horst as a new Nazi. Horst was upset. I said, how can I prove to you that I'm not a Nazi, new or old? I said, you're not a Nazi. I know you're not a Nazi. He said, yes, but I need to prove it. And I thought about this question, and anyone who's a lawyer will know it's very hard to prove a negative. The best I could come up, having discovered by now that Horst sat on an archive of about 10,000 pages of letters, diaries, photographs, audio tapes, and other documents. The entire personal archive of his mother and father, Otto and Charlotte. And I said, why don't you give that archive to a museum? Because Nazis tend not to give family archive of that kind to a museum. And people will treat that as a very decent act, not the act of a neo-Nazi. It's a terrific idea, which museum? I suggested the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, who duly came along and digitized 10,000 pages of Wechsler family archives, causing, it has to be said, incandescence amongst many other members of the extended Wechsler family. That material then became available, but not easily. And Horst said to me, would you like a copy? I said, I'd love to have a copy. And in due course, a couple of weeks later, this is quite an ecological sort of fellow, came a tatty, multi-used little envelope containing a single USB stick with many gigabytes of incredible material. And from this material, which took me a lot of time working with some remarkable graduate and doctoral students, we went through the entire 10,000 pages, digitally, transcribed a lot of it to proper professional standards, translated it, and then interpreted and uncovered the story that is the book, the Ratline. I stand by every word that is in the book. I've applied the same standards in writing the book as I would in a court of law or in a university-published document. It is fully referenced, fully endnoted, fully supported. I do not accept, as Horst continues to say, that it is full of lies and untruths, and that I've somehow missed all the good bits about his father. I think the real problem about the book for Horst may be the role played by his mother. Because I've come to the understanding, with the assistance of a great number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychoanalysts with whom I have conversed and worked now over a decade, that this is actually a story about a man's love not for his father, but for his mother. And that the love Horst has for his mother, who is the beating heart of the Ratline book, in my view, is the real reason he feels the need to defend his father. He often will say to me, I didn't really know my father. He was away fighting the war. He was away doing this. Occasionally he would meet him. It's my mother I really loved. And because the mother loved the father, Horst has engaged in a sort of transference into defending the honour and reputation of the father, which is actually a way of defending the mother. this. What I wanted to know was how it was that a couple, highly intelligent, highly educated, highly cultured, could get involved in such horrors. How does it happen? It is the great mystery. How can a man like Otto Wächter, who goes to the University of Vienna Law Faculty, entering on the same day in October 1919 as his classmate Hirsch Lauterbach, whose parents and entire family he will oversee the murder of 25 years later. Then, in 1938, write letters to his own university professor, to the dean of the law school who signed his graduation certificate, removing them from their jobs. This was in his capacity as state secretary. And then participate in their banishment to places like Dachau and Buchenwald, from where they never returned. And I don't have an answer to that question. How can it be? But I have a sense of the road that allows that to happen. And it begins with the crossing of a line. As early as 1921, when he beats up a few Jews in a large demonstration in central Vienna, basically gets away with it. Or then in 1934, leads the killing of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, Austrian Chancellor, causing him then to have to flee, and gets away with it. The skies never fall when you cross these little lines. And once you've crossed a little line, you can cross a slightly bigger line, and then an even bigger line, and eventually it leads to mass murder. And throughout the exercise, he has a companion. And what we know from the documentation, this was quite startling for me. His wife, his love, Charlotte Wächter, knew absolutely everything that he did and totally supported. And that is one of the untold stories. In the cases I do in the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice or other courts, and in this story, it's the role of the spouse who is deeply complicit. And that is articulated for me in a single moment that takes place on the 15th of March 1938, when Otto and Charlotte have stood on the balcony of the Heldenplatz 1 meter from Adolf Hitler, greeting the crowds below. After the ceremony is over, they enter the Hofburg, they walk down the huge marble staircase, and at the bottom of the marble staircase, which I have been to, some of you may also know, Otto turns to Charlotte, and we know this because she recorded it and wrote it up in full detail, and says to his wife, "Now, my darling, I have a choice to make. I can continue or resume my lucrative career as a commercial lawyer, and we will make a lot of money and do very well. Or I can accept the offer of my dear friend, Arthur Seyss-Inquart." Pause for a moment. A great deal of interest in this book because of the central role played by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was Horst Wächter's godfather, and to this day, Horst Wächter sleeps in bed on the wall next to which is a photograph of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, his godfather. In Holland, that will resonate differently from the Hamburg. What should I do? And Charlotte says, take the political job. And I've thought long and hard about what would have happened to that couple, and what would have happened to their 6 children, and what would have happened to their 23 grandchildren if Charlotte had instead done the right thing and said, get out of this horror story. Now, while you still can, go into your boring job do the right thing, show a bit of civil courage when you get to this crossroads, and say no to seizing power. If that had happened, you wouldn't have received a letter from Horst. You wouldn't have received a letter from Otto. Because 75 years later, the family is still convulsed by that single decision taken at the bottom of a marble staircase on the 15th of March, 1938. The legacy goes on and on and on. Let me stop there and let's open up for a conversation next.
Philippe, I don't know if you noticed, you could hear a pin drop while you were speaking. What a journey this book took you on, and what a journey it takes the readers on. I think I want to return to what would have happened if a little bit later on. I'd like to probe a couple of the other issues that you raised. One of the remarkable features of your work is your ability to suspend any judgmental tone in order for your subjects to be able to express their truths and their understandings of themselves, their families, and their experiences. You accomplished this deftly when discussing Horst, even if it was clear to him that you two had completely different narratives with regard to his father's culpability. Allow me an analogy that brings this complex position closer to home. In my research on Gulag loyalists, communist loyalists who survived the Gulag, few blamed the party for their hardship, even though many of their parents had been executed during the Great Terror, and many had spent years of forced labor in wretched conditions in the Gulag. The truth about what Russia's 20th century leaders did to their own people was one that I found self-evident, and it was also based on massive evidence. My interviewees, however, took a different view, and they reconceptualized their experience to put the party and their belief in it in a favorable light. This required quite a delicate balancing act to talk and later to write about. So in this vein, one of the moments in your book I found particularly symbolic was when you discovered the copy of Mein Kampf on Horst's bookshelf. It was a gift from Charlotte to Otto, inscribed with the words, quote, "Through struggle and love to the finish." Horst seemed heartened that the book had been found again. Can you tell us more about how you negotiated this personal divide with Horst?
Just a moment about finding that book. You've got to imagine a 15th century Knights Templar extraordinary castle, which Horst has really devoted the latter part of his life to preserving, and I really honour the work he has done in trying to save this castle. It's extraordinary work. It is an extraordinary place. And in the top floor, if you like, the attic, right at the top, is the library, the National Socialist Library. And Horst would take me up there. It would occasionally, he'd always lock the door afterwards, but very often lose the key. And in the film, some of you will have seen the scene where, having lost the key, he had to get one of those huge metal bolt cutters to get into his own library. And you'd go into the library and you'd see rows and rows of shelves. And at one moment I just picked out a book. It had a black cover, and I opened it. I thought, oh my God, this is Mein Kampf. and it was inscribed by Charlotte to Otto. And it was 1931, I think, and it said, to my darling, for our joint struggle. And Horst was thrilled because he hadn't been aware that the book was there. And exactly as you described, as I described in the book, he was just pleased to have the copy of the book that his mother had given his father. But it also, I remember, occasionally remarked how sad he was that he'd lost a copy given to him by his godfather, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, which may or may not have been personally inscribed by the Führer, and which had been lost and has not been found. But that is the kind of place Horst occupies. You put your hand into a pile and something astonishing or awful comes out of it. Throughout that kind of experience, I'm always trying to keep my sang-froid, keep my cool, not get excited, not get upset, not get angry. And that, frankly, comes from my training as a lawyer. That comes from spending years in courts where you know the judges are not interested in your personal views, they're not interested in your emotions, they're not interested in your passions. They just want the facts and the law laid out as clearly and neutrally as possible. And I think that when you spend 30 years of your life doing that, it's very hard to throw off those shackles. There are moments where those shackles do get thrown off. Those of you who've seen the film My Nazi Legacy will recall a moment where I lose my cool with Horst Wächter. We're in Lviv, we're in the aula of the university. It's the very room where Hans Frank has announced the extermination of the entire Jewish community, 500,000 people, more in the city and the surrounding area. And I finally found the document, the official document from the Americans and the Poles indicting his father for mass murder. And I showed this to Horst, and one of the magical things about Horst, in a ghastly sort of way, is that whatever you show him, he comes up with a sort of way of reinterpreting it. So he takes the document and he says, of course. I said, what do you mean, of course? He says, well, it's a Soviet document. I said, it's not a Soviet document, it's an American, Polish document. He said, yes, but they were in cahoots with the Soviets out to get my father. It's not a real document, it's made up, it's invented. Or there is a document from 1939 where Otto writes to Charlotta from Krakow. He says, marvellous, marvellous. The Vienna Philharmonic has been to perform in my city. Lots of famous dignitaries have come, and I'm getting lots of credit. It's very good for me. There's a little bit of local difficulty, and tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. This is what he's writing home to his wife. This was incidentally the first act of reprisal killing personally ordered by Adolf Hitler in the Second World War, in the occupation of Poland. So for me, this is rather dispositive that Otto Wächter was involved in an act of reprisal killing, but that's not how Horst interprets it. Horst's interpretation is, you see, Philippe, look at the words, and we spend a lot of time making sure the translations are absolutely perfect. The translation, in this case, becomes very important. And Horst says, but you see, look, it says, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. It doesn't say tomorrow I want to have 50 Poles shot. He plainly didn't want to do it. Now, when you get those kinds of interpretations, it is immensely exasperating, because it's a reading that is wrong, that is counterintuitive, and it is motivated by other objectives and desires. In the hour, the first example I gave you, I got very upset with Horst. I think it's because we were in Lviv. It's the one time in the entire 10 years that I really got angry. Because of where we were. I think that was very, very important. Unfortunately for me, it was recorded on film. And David Evans, the film director, then said, oh, that's brilliant, I love that. I wasn't so thrilled, and he said, well, do you want it out? I said, well, it's not my film, it's your film, you have to decide. That was the deal, you do, it's your film, you do whatever you want. So he put it in, and my mother-in-law refers to it as the elder abuse moment, where I turned on this poor, innocent, gorgeous, lovely old man, shouting at him because he was reading the document wrong. And I didn't like that then, because it goes against all of that training. But it's not, I think, just the training. I think I'm very attracted to writing of the quality that strips out emotion. My favourite writer in this regard is Stefan Zweig, who strips all the emotion out of accounts he gives of the most appalling things. I'm thinking particularly of The World of Yesterday and various other writings. And I'm attracted to that style of writing precisely because it allows the reader to form their own view. I believe passionately as a reader and as a writer that the writer must not impose upon the reader the emotion that the writer would like the reader to have. Our job is to lay out a story and allow the reader to take that story in an interpretive mode in the way that they wish to take the story. And I think, again, that is very closely connected to the life of a litigating lawyer. One of the golden rules in litigation, for me anyway, is you never say to a judge, this is what I think you should do. Just as I think no writer should ever say, this is what I want you to think. With the judge, your job is to lay out facts and offer a legal interpretation which allows, hopefully, the judge to come to the same conclusion as you would like the judge to come to, without ever saying to the judge, this is what you must do. And I think it's the same, and that is the central reason. It's born out of respect for the reader, and it's motivated by the belief that no text can ever have a single meaning, and reasonable readers can interpret the same material in different ways, and that is a very good thing.
Well, again, it's quite remarkable how you have filtered yourself out of this equation. And we can see you there in this scene, picking up Mein Kampf with words in it about devotion to the struggle. And there you are with someone who's excited to find that copy back. So I thought it was a brilliant example, but there are many, many more. I'd like to turn for a moment to looted art. Moving to another type of, let's say, souvenir. At some point, when you were describing Otto's dire need for money, when he was in hiding in 1949, you talk almost in passing about Charlotte's catalogs and sales of presumably looted art to support Otto. She seemed skilled at this task, but it must have required quite an elaborate underground network and operation. Can you say any more about that? I mean, I can only think about how it is to sell anything, anytime, but under such circumstances, it seems remarkable.
Well, I think we need to be clear here. We're not talking about sort of home drawings or children's sketches. You know, there's the wonderful line in one of the letters. I've decided to sell the Dürer to help you live your life in Rome for a few days more and buy yourself a pair of shoes. She's been equipped with this extraordinary collection. Why? In December 1939, Otto Wächter, the governor of Krakow, gives her a piece of paper, which he signs, and which she takes to the National Museum in Krakow, turns up, meets the director, and says, look, here's a piece of paper in which my husband, the governor, has said I can take anything I want from this museum and take it home to have on walls and line the floors and whatever. It was a wonderful life. You can understand why at the bottom of that marble staircase, from Charlotte's perspective, if the choice is between A, the boring life of a commercial lawyer, or B, the person who can go to a gallery of art and have anything you want, she's going to go for B. And that's what she does. And she gathers up the Bruegels and the Dürers and brings them home, and a lot of them disappear. Some get found, some get returned. Some are still in the possession of the Werthers. Horst told me that dear Charlotta had the habit, when each of her beloved children got married, of giving them a gift. And the gift was an item from the good old days. Horst, and I want to give him big credit for this, has pretty much given everything back. I say pretty much because his daughter pointed out to me, when I said that to her, actually, Philippe, not quite. There's the tea service. And the tea service resides today, looted from the Villa Mendel in Vienna in 1939, resides in Horst Schloss, but he has undertaken to give it back to the owner, whose daughter lives in Brisbane, Australia, as soon as COVID is over and it can be transported back at a reasonable cost. And I honour and respect Horst's decision to return. One of the things I was not able to learn was what the mechanisms were in 1949 for the act of selling. We do know from the family archive, from the letters, that they were both incredibly well connected. And one of the challenges in dealing with the archival material, the letters and the diaries, is that particularly in the period 48 to 49, when Otto's on the run and worried he's going to be caught by the Americans or the British or the Poles or the Jews or the Soviets, is that everything is encoded. All the names are coded, and we had to spend 4 years trying to work out who was who and what was what. And I must confess, I focused more on the escape route and how he was hidden, who hit him. What was the network, which turned out to be a network of senior Nazis, Italian fascists, and a few senior Vatican officials in cahoots against the new threat, namely the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union. But I suspect the network for the selling of these items of art was a similar network of well-placed, highly influential senior sources. There's one little anecdote in the book that concerns a painting that was taken, stolen, purloined, appropriated, you choose your word, from the National Gallery in Krakow by a painter called Bruegel. There was a problem with the archive in the National Gallery of Krakow in that it did not indicate whether the Carnival of Lent and May was a version by Bruegel the older or Bruegel the younger. Now, a lot turns on this fact, as many of you in the room will appreciate. But the painting is never seen again. It disappears off the face of the earth. But a version of Bruegel the older's Carnival of Lent and May hangs in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And of course, the reasonable person might ask themselves whether there is a relationship between what happened in Krakow in December 1939 and the painting Horst and I visited in October 2015 and stood before at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Could they be the same painting or not? The day after Horst and I visited the painting, it was on the occasion of the show of the documentary I mentioned at the Vienna Film Festival, the Biennale, which was actually a wonderful event Nicholas came to. And the two of them had a pretty furious row in front of hundreds of bemused Austrians. But the day after we visited the painting, the Kunsthistoriker, magically it was removed from the wall, which of course only tends to fuel your suspicions that there might be a relationship between the two paintings. but the painting is now back and hanging again. So there are leads.
There are a lot of small stories connected with each of these.
This story made it to the front page of the Financial Times, causing quite a lot of mayhem for quite a few people for quite a few weeks, and I felt a bit bad that I had unwittingly stumbled into this story, and that my role was simply to say what I knew.
Did I correctly understand that not all of the surviving previous owners or their descendants particularly wanted to have contact or even to have their objects back after they had been in the family's hands, or is that something? I know that Horst has made valiant efforts to return what he has, but I had a sense that some of the potential recipients wanted nothing to do with this discussion.
Well, one of the joys of wandering around Horst's Schloss in his company is you'd sort of come across objects and you'd say, this print of Krakow, did you buy it? Or was it a gift? And there were quite a few of these things. And Horst explained that they had actually come from Mother. And he had tried to give some of them back a few years earlier and had even taken a trip to Poland. But those he had met with had not wished to deal with it. But in the time that I have been with him, he has returned the objects, and they have been accepted. And there have been newspaper articles about which he is justifiably proud. So as far as I'm concerned, he has either given stuff back or attempted to give stuff back, and I'm not aware that he's hanging on to anything that he shouldn't be hanging on to. But I am aware that he has siblings who are rather unhappy that stuff has been returned, and he has expressed the view that they simply should also return their marriage presents. And one of them referred to him as a Judas. I mean, one of the difficulties here, it's very complicated, because on the one hand, I don't like Horst's interpretation of history. On the other hand, I deeply respect and honour that he has talked to me openly, that he has given me any document I've ever asked for, that he has been completely 100% transparent in the deepest and most honourable way. And for all of this, he has paid a very big price in relation to his relations with his own family. The story that you told at the outset of having received a letter from one of the grandsons is interesting to me. This is a new development. Indicating, as you described it, and I'm paraphrasing, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the concern of the grandson is not so much with my behaviour, but with Horst's behaviour. And Horst has effectively been cut off from large parts of his own family for the crime of engaging with me in a very honest and open way. So I find myself very, very conflicted. But the complexities go on and on. I was in Vienna a month ago to do a presentation of Die Ratline, the German language edition of the book, in Austria, at the MAK Museum, a wonderful place in Vienna. And when that was publicised on the web, Horst got in touch with the museum and said he wanted to have a right of reply to whatever horrors I would share with the members in the audience. And I was asked, the director of the museum got in touch and said, would I participate in a right of reply for Horst? I said, of course. I'm a president of the English pen, I'm a passionately believer in freedom of expression, would I participate? Yes, of course. And so there was then scheduled the night after my presentation, Horst's presentation. And then when Horst's presentation was publicised, Horst's daughter got in touch and asked for a right of reply to her father. So on the subject of memory, identity, it just goes on.
Well, I want to pick up on one of those themes. Obviously, you have had an instrumental influence on Horst. That's quite clear. I'd like to turn to Otto's alleged murder. You devote considerable attention to the possibility that Otto Wächter might have been murdered. This slightly changes the conversation you were having with Horst, as it created an opportunity for him to frame his father as a victim. And he says in theory that the theory that my father was a criminal, I cannot accept. I suspect that you were not just fascinated with what actually happened, but with illuminating how malleable our perceptions of people and past events can be. One need only look at the current national narratives of suffering that are transforming many former villains into heroes. Of course, that isn't the case here, but it does tread into the victim-perpetrator categorization discussion, and it raises questions regarding the memory of select truths. I sense that may have been a guiding factor in your probe. So, aside from ascertaining the facts, perhaps you could comment on what you considered so relevant in determining whether or not Otto was murdered.
So, Horst does indeed passionately believe that his father was murdered. The alternative death scenario, because he died as a young man in unexpected, sudden circumstances in Rome on the 13th of July 1949, having visited an anonymized old comrade at Lake Albano a couple of weekends earlier, and then fallen ill, desperately ill, to the point that he died. So, and this is the point where you put on, your litigator's hat. So, what are the facts? So, you go through 10,000 pages of materials, and you notice that between 1949, 13th of July, and about the mid-1970s, there's no reference at all to Otto Wächter having been poisoned in Charlotta's contemporaneous records, notes, letters, and so on and so forth. It's only the mid-1970s that she starts referring, particularly in an interview she gives to a distinguished German historian in Die Zeit, newspaper, and he's a writer also in Die Zeit. She says, I've heard it, she says on tape, got the audio tape, she says, my husband was murdered. But she's never said it before. It's really interesting. So, why did she suddenly say it in the mid-1970s? What happened? So we worked out what happened. In, I think, 73 or 74, the memoir of the Austrian bishop Alois Hudal was published. Alois Hudal is the, quote, religious gentleman, unquote, who Otto Wächter has met at the end of April 1949 when he arrives in Rome, and who is the former close colleague of the man, Cardinal Pacelli, who became Pius XII, who has parked Otto Wächter in the Vigna Pia monastery for safety for 3 months, from April 1949 until his death in July 1949. Hudal's memoir is published in 73 or 74. And it contains a paragraph which says, as Otto Wächter lay dying in my arms, he told me he had been poisoned by an old comrade who was working for the Americans. We went back to look at the history of that memoir. Hudal had died in 1963. He had never elsewhere indicated that belief. He had never said it to Charlotte Wächter in their numerous encounters in 1949 when Wächter died, or subsequently. I was interested in when the memoir was written. And we found the original manuscript in the Institute of Anima in Rome, in Hudal's archive. It was written in 1952, and I checked it to see if it included that paragraph. And it did. So already in 1952, Hudal had written that paragraph, but he never apparently publicly uttered it in the remaining 10 years of his life, and it didn't emerge until 1973. So what happened? I think what happened is that Hudal, in 1952, the year he wrote his memoir, was removed from his office because there had been an outcry in the Italian press that this Vatican bishop had been harbouring and giving safety to serious Nazi criminals. And he had to retire early, and he went into retirement in his house in Grotta Ferrata near Lake Albano. And I think what he did was he started to run a narrative around the time he wrote his memoir, which turned the Nazi perpetrators into victims. That's a sort of classic strategy. You immediately create empathy, and these people were actually, whatever they did, in the end, they were killed. And so the source of Horst's belief is that single sentence in the Hudal memoir, and there is thus far no other evidence to support it, but Horst hangs on to it for the same reason I suspect that Hudal. I'm very careful in the beginning of the book, but Hudal wrote it, but that does not prove that Werther actually said it to him. But just to go a little bit further, just the alternative scenario is that he died of leptospirosis, and he loved swimming, and he caught it while swimming either in the River Tiber or at Lake Albano. And in 1949, to get leptospirosis, it could be a death sentence. And I went to consult with 4 different leading medical experts of the world. I gave them medical records, the letters, the symptoms, everything. And they all said, yes, this is leptospirosis. And so your reading that would have been my own view is, I don't think it was poison, but I don't completely close that door. But
you made Herculean efforts to ascertain this.
Because it was being respectful to Horst. That's what Horst believes, so I thought it was my responsibility to do that. But let me just share one tiny anecdote with you. 3 months ago, I received an email from Jerusalem from a writer, a well-known writer, a literary figure, who writes to me to say, I've read your Ratline. He's actually now the translator into Hebrew of the Ratline. And I need to share a story with you. I need to tell you about my father-in-law, Sergio Minerbi is his name. Sergio Minerbi was born in Italy in the 1920s. He was Jewish. He was hidden during the German occupation in a monastery. And in 1945, after the liberation of Europe, he left with his mother Fanny, who was born in Warsaw, to Palestine. And while he was in Palestine, he joined the organization that became Mossad. After Israel obtained independence, he, in the summer of 1948, was sent by Mossad as a 4-man hit squad back to Rome. And Sergio Minerbi's job was to keep tabs on what Bishop Alois Hudal was up to and follow all of the people around Alois Hudal. The guy who wrote to me sent me the extract in Italian of Sergio Minerbi's memoir, and it said all of this. And this was, new material, right? It's not in the book. And Minerbi, by 2017, when he was writing the book, was now 95 years old, something, really aged. And he couldn't remember what he'd done in Rome. So he asked for the archives of Mossad to be opened. This is in 2017, so he can remind himself, refresh his memory as to what exactly he'd done in Rome in the summer of 1948. Oh, the other interesting bit of the extract from Sergio Minerbi's memoir is that he returns to Israel in August 1949, 2 weeks after Werther dies. So all of this begins to suggest that there's something worth exploring. But the question is, will we get into the archives in Israel to allow us?
I have no doubt that this is going to have a second incarnation.
I've got a good contact. So someone in Israel wrote a fantastic review of East West Street in a happily progressive newspaper called Haaretz. And amazingly, that person a few weeks ago was elected president of Israel. And so I'm thinking I've got a really good contact.
Yes, you do.
To get into those archives.
So, Philippe, I have one last question with an eye on the time, because I know the audience is eager to ask questions as well. Turning to an issue that involves both East-West and the Ratline. Hirsch Lauterbach and Raphael Lemkin shaped our words and actions with regard to human rights, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and their codification in international criminal law. It seems apparent that Otto Wächter's whereabouts were known not just by the Vatican, but by the Americans, who were major actors at Nuremberg. On that note, the Ratline itself seems to have been supported or ignored by Western forces who hoped they could, so to speak, weaponize old Nazis in their Cold War battles against the Soviets. In the 1950s, oversaw the overturning of sentences and the release, return, and reintegration of old Nazis into German society at all levels. So, how do you think, I hope you can answer this briefly, even though it's a big question, how do you think Lemkin and Lauterbach would reconcile these developments with their hopes regarding the impact of Nuremberg? Or is Nuremberg still a work in progress?
I think they would be appalled. I think they would be appalled if they read the Ratline. To know that Otto Wächter arrived in Rome on the 29th of April 1949. He was met by the religious gentleman, who we know to have been Alois Hudal. And what I learned, thanks to the wonderful support of a professor at Florida State University, Norman Goder, who's the country's leading expert on CIA and CIC, US Counterintelligence Corps archives, was that Alois Hudal was an American spy. Alois Hudal was being paid $50 a month in cash to report to the Americans on people of interest. And we now know that within 24 hours of Wächter's arrival in Rome, Hudal had reported to his handler, the wonderfully named Thomas Lucid, that Wächter has arrived. He's operating under the name Alfredo Reinhardt, and this is where he's going to be staying. And the Americans did nothing. This really confused me. And as you know, you've read the book very carefully, I have had the great happiness for 20 years, but sadly no more because he passed away last December, a year ago, of being the neighbour of the writer John le Carre. I don't know anything about the Cold War. It's not my area. I've never looked at it. He does. So I told him about this when I'd come across. And he said, send me a few of the documents. He told me which ones he wanted. He comforted me and bring some cakes. And we sat for many hours. He did quite a lot of preparation. But it was what he said at the introduction that really surprised me. Incidentally, if you're interested in listening to this, some of you may have listened to the podcast, The Ratline. Episode 6 is the moment where you can listen to le Carre telling this story. And hear it, there's nothing beats hearing it in his own voice. He has the most incredible voice. It's free on the BBC website. You can find it very easily. And he said, it was very confusing. I was there in that period. My job was to, that was a question, interrogate Germans in camps, detention camps, prisoner of war camps, internment camps. And I said, what, to find the killers and to prosecute them? He said, no, to recruit. And he said, for an 18-year-old, that was really confusing, because I had grown up being told that the Nazis were the worst of the worst, and we had to hunt them down. And now I was being told that they were our friends in the struggle against the new enemy, which was the Soviets. We had to, as he put it, turn on a sixpence. And so he was horrified. And in fact, he attributes that period when he was based in Graz in Austria, doing this, to everything that follows that you all know so well in his writings, George Smiley and others, the duplicity, the double standards, it's all to do at its heart, not just with the Cold War, but with the relationship with the Nazis, trying to get their Rolodexes, because they knew who the collaborators were, they knew who the communists were, they knew who the spies were. And I think, in answer to your question, as I said, I think they would be horrified. I'm horrified. We know that the world is an absolutely filthy place, and I think that it's now pretty clear that the Ratline was in very large part an American construct, and it was a recruitment tool. It was a way of finding senior Nazis, including mass murderers, including indicted mass murderers. We know, for example, the Americans knew all about Klaus Barbie and followed him along the Ratline, knew exactly where he had gone, and had contributed to his exfiltration. That's the Canada's word. So this is pretty shocking stuff. It happened then, and I'm absolutely sure it happens now. And it was that part of the story, of course, that came out of the blue for me. First 5 years I know Horst, I'm focused on everything up to 1945. But the second 5 years of knowing Horst, all of a sudden, and it only comes out when he gives me the archive, is this absolutely shocking material. It's absolutely shocking what happened. There's no other way, I think, to...
Well, we could go on also talking about the efficacy of Nuremberg, but I'm going to finish with this because I do know some questions are waiting. I'd like to say this. When I finished reading The Ratline, and actually both books, I was sorry to be done. I felt like starting all over again.
And there's a third one coming.
That's what I want to ask. The brilliant ending of The Ratline, which I won't diverge, it ended, but I didn't want it to end. So my last question is, if you could just say in 2 sentences, what is your next work on?
I'm excessively verbose. I can't stop talking. Because it's all so interesting. That's the problem. It's all so interesting. So Wächter is a tiny figure in East-West Street. Ratline has a tiny figure called Walter Raaf. Walter Raaf was a comrade of Otto Wächter, another senior SS officer who'd operated in North Africa, in Italy and other places, and whose great claim to fame was that he was the inventor of the mobile gas chamber, the little vans that would drive around parts of German-occupied Eastern Europe, killing people in groups of 20 and 30, but deemed to be too inefficient to be useful over the long term. Wächter occupied the monk's cell at the Vigna Pia monastery that had previously been occupied by Walter Raaf. Raaf goes to Syria, where it is alleged, amongst other things, he was hired by Mossad, and writes a letter to Wächter saying, don't come to Syria, it's too disorganized for German types. Go to South Africa or South America, where conditions will be more of the kind we are used to. So Raaf takes himself off to Ecuador and settles in Quito with his wife and 2 kids, whereupon he meets in 1953 a charming Chilean military man who is the military attaché at the Chilean embassy in Ecuador, who says, my dear friend, you are in the wrong country. You should be in my country. We like your type of people. Come to Chile. And so in 1958, Raaf set moves to Chile, moves his wife and kids to Chile. 15 years later, his friend, because they have stayed in very close contact, assumes the presidency of Chile. It's Augusto Pinochet. And the rumour is that Ralph starts working for Pinochet's intelligence service, the DINA. And in the course of his activities, Ralph is said, choosing my words very carefully, to have interrogated a young Chilean writer who in 1990 writes an affidavit describing how he was personally tortured whilst blindfolded by a man with a thick German accent whom he believed to be Walter Ralph. That affidavit then became part of the general dossier that made its way to Madrid and to London, causing Senator Pinochet, as he then was, to be arrested in London in 1998. And on the 20th of October 1998, onto my desk in London, when Senator Pinochet's lawyers contacted me and asked me to act in the defense of Senator Pinochet, which I would have done, except that my wife said to me that if I acted for Pinochet, she would divorce me. So I declined the instruction. Just a word. In the British legal system, a barrister has a principle for cases in the English courts known as the cab rank principle. We are just taxi drivers. We're driving along as a lawyer. Someone puts their hands up and says, well, take me to Liverpool Street Station. You can't say, oh, I don't like that person, I don't like their politics. You've got to take. And it's the same for a barrister. So you've got to, I managed to find a way out of it. And a week later, I was working for Human Rights Watch against Senator Pinochet, which my wife was much happier about. So the third book will tell the double story of Ralph in Chile, or Ralph in Santiago, actually Ralph in Punta Arenas, where I'm going in 2 weeks' time. I'm very excited, and Pinochet in London.
We can't wait. We can't wait.
One of the things that people forget, it's remarkable, it's a complete connection with East-West Street. Pinochet was indicted by Balthazar Garzón for crimes against humanity and genocide, because unbelievably, one of Franco's last acts was to incorporate into the law of Spain the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, giving universal jurisdiction arguments to Spanish judges like Garzón to bring these kinds of cases.
So you have brought that circle around.
It literally,
and you will. You're working on that.
Does come all the way around.
Back to East-West Street. I have had the privilege of having you all. In just a moment, I just want to say you really have shown us how every word counts. I know that you are all as sad as I am about ending this conversation this evening, but I can say for those of you who haven't finished the book, you will continue your conversation with Philippe as you read it. He is on every page of this and in every page, and we will all be waiting with bated breath for the next edition. And in the meantime, there are also the podcasts that you can listen to of Philippe. I think that your work has had a great impact on all of us, and we are very grateful for that. I'm also very grateful to all of you for your wonderful questions, for being here tonight, also for our online audience across the world. Philippe, thank you so much.